Okay, let's start with a stakeholder story. I always remember my first entrepreneur initiative was food traceability company, and the success was fully based on the fact that the whole food chain had to be connected, integrated, and share information. So our belief at that time when we started the business was that the path, we didn't have a purpose, but we had a clear belief that the path to success was dependent on everyone's contributions, which actually led clients to improve their performance, including financial performance, when compared to their peers, neighbors, competitors. So it was very interesting that on the idea of becoming a conscious capitalist, I was unconsciously moving towards that as my first entrepreneurial activity. Now, later on in that journey, I recognized that we were just looking at the tip of the iceberg regarding to the stakeholder interdependence, looking at this as a much bigger, idea, which we share in the field guide. So can you share with us from your experience, from your journey, from all the research you've done, something that actually ties up the importance of stakeholders being part of the overall success of a company?
Sure. I think the best story for me has always been the Whole Foods flood story. Whole Foods today is a huge company with maybe 600 stores and 120,000 employees and 30 million customers and so forth, a big impact in the world. But it started as a tiny little company in Austin, Texas in 1978, just one store, but immediately it was very successful, because they had a clear vision for what they were trying to do. They treated their people well. They had strong relationships all around. They became an indispensable member of the community very quickly. But a year and a half later, there was a massive flood that happened in Austin, Texas. This was the Memorial Day flood of 1980. And this was the biggest flood in 100 years in that city. And many people died, and there was a huge amount of damage that happened. The flood waters were about 7 or 8 feet high at the location that Whole Foods had their only store. And so it completely destroyed that store, all of the inventory, and they had very few canned goods, right? So most of the products were fresh. Those were all destroyed. The equipment, the refrigeration equipment, the freezers, the cash registers, everything, all of that was destroyed. The place was a complete mess. It was filled with mud and sludge and sewage. And so the next morning when the waters went down, and the founders of the company came to look at the damage, it was devastating. It was like a war scene. And they knew that they actually were $400,000 in debt at that point, because they had received inventory from their suppliers and they hadn't actually paid many of those suppliers yet. So they had no money in the bank. They had maxed out their line of credit, and they owed their suppliers and others $400,000, and they had no money to rebuild and buy new equipment and all the rest of it, right? So at that moment, they were technically in bankruptcy, or they would be. They were bankrupt, and it's only a matter of time. So they were thinking this, and then some of their employees start showing up, and they see this scene, and they are in tears, because for many of them, this was the most meaningful job that they had. Right? Because they all care about food, they all cared about health, and this was the first time they were able to integrate those two things into their work and a great culture that they experienced. As this was happening, they started to see other people showing up. So these were regular customers that they recognized, but also people who happened to live in the community and others. They started showing up there. They were carrying buckets and mops and anything they could find in their homes that would help them clean up. And they said, "Come on, let's start the cleanup. Why are you guys just standing around?" Right? And the employees and others said, "Well, we don't know what's going to happen here. Well, let's try. Let's clean it up. See if we can fix this." Right? So suddenly it gave energy to the employees and a sense of hope that maybe we can do something. Now the founder standing there thought this was all okay, but how are we going to actually survive? We don't know how we're going to do this, right? But then this started happening, and people started noticing there's something unusual going on here. Here's a for-profit business where people are showing up and spending days of their time voluntarily, right? And they even told the employees, "We don't think we can pay you. We have no money." They said, "Doesn't matter. We'll work without pay, and we'll see." what happens, right?
Uh-huh.
And so they all start doing this. It kind of becomes part of the news in the town, like, oh, people are coming over to see what's going on. And so their suppliers found out about this. Now, the suppliers were much larger companies for the most part, right? So they came around to see what was going on and said, wow, this is an unusual company. So they said to the Whole Foods people that, okay, if you are able to restart this company, then we will restock you on credit. You don't have to pay us anything, and we will write off a lot of what you owe us, right? The bankers came around and they said, wow, we haven't seen this in any other business that we have lent to. So we're going to double your line of credit, even though you are not credit worthy by any of our normal standards, right? The original friends and family who had invested money in the company, $40,000 only, but they also came and said, okay, we're going to reinvest. We're going to put more money back into the company, right? So what happened as a result of this was that, and people started organizing bake sales and music concerts, raise money for Whole Foods.
Yeah.
Right? Because they said, we love Whole Foods. This is an integral part of our life. We don't want to see this company die. Right? And so this company was able to reopen this store in 21 days. Wow. Nobody imagined that was even possible, right? And this company would not exist today were it not for the love of all of their stakeholders. And why did they receive that love? Because they had given that love in the first place, right? They started out with this mindset of being kind of a family, and everybody matters and everybody is connected. And so it shows the power of that. And from that day on, for Whole Foods, making sure that they do not disappoint their stakeholders, make sure that they serve their stakeholders well, became a big part of it. They felt an obligation almost to say, wow, if it weren't for the stakeholders, we would be dead. So we better make sure that we don't lose sight of this value.
So it's amazing because, I heard the story many times. I think this for the first time, I don't know if I paid more attention to a specific word, which is love. I think the world is more ready to listen to love in the corporate environment than before, right? But even your first book, Firms of Endearment, which was like a milestone on this whole journey, it's connected to something that is love driven, a movie, right? Yeah, but and on the other hand, there's there are signs. We come out from last century from a shareholder supremacy, right? Everything for the shareholder. Now, are we seeing more signs of that supremacy declining, the shareholder supremacy decline?
Yeah, I think so. I think the idea of stakeholder management and the stakeholder mindset, I think, is becoming more mainstream. I mean, it's common sense, Ed Freeman, who's the father of stakeholder theory, says, this is not rocket science. This is obvious at some level, right? And by the way, before 1970, most American corporations were quite stakeholder oriented. If you look at General Electric, and how it became such a great company, it was because they cared deeply. They were proud of paying their employees very well. They were proud of the amount of money that they spent, paying taxes. They were proud of all the investments that they made in society and in communities and so forth, right? So there was a strong stakeholder mindset. It was only after 1970 with Milton Friedman's essay, and then agency theory by Jensen and Meckling in 1976, that it all became part of the business school curriculum. And economists like Milton Friedman and others kind of convinced business people that this is your only purpose. You only exist here to do this one thing. And that is just a very, very narrow mindset that somehow has become accepted as okay. So that has been around, as I said, for about 50 years, but has not always been the case. So now we're returning to it. And I think there are signs, if you look at Business Roundtable, if you look at the Davos Declaration, if you look at many other, even BlackRock and others, starting to recognize that, we have to look at business not as a maximization of one thing, but an optimization of a system. In any interconnected system, if you just try to maximize one element of that, that's like me saying that when I think about my health, I'm only going to focus on my right arm and making it as strong as possible, and I won't care about the rest, or I'll only care about the rest to the extent that they serve my right arm. Well, ultimately, my body will weaken and I will die. Right? We call that a stakeholder cancer. Yeah. Cancer is when one part of a system grows on its own for its own sake, not for the sake of the flourishing of the whole. That is cancer, and ultimately that is suicidal, because that'll kill the host organism. And so an extreme shareholder mindset, I believe, is also suicidal. We see many, you look at General Electric, it's a great example of a company that under Jack Welch was purely shareholder oriented. They laid off hundreds of thousands of people over those years. They had all kinds of ethical things, environmental, pollution, all kinds of things that they did, always with an eye on the share price, right? And briefly, they became the world's most valuable company. But if you look at them today, they're less than 1/10 the size of that, because none of that was sustainable. That was not true value. I differentiate between true profits and real profits, right? The real profits versus the illusion of profits. And when you have just a profit maximization mindset, you can create profit on paper, but that's not real profit, right? And secondly, it's not really creating value, it's extracting value from your customers, and from your employees. It's damaging their health and it's damaging the planet. You're doing all of that to create value for the owners, right? So that's not a business. I call that a parasite. Business creates value, parasites suck out value. That kind of a business is simply sucking out value. So I think we are getting there. Now, as with anything, when the status quo gets challenged a lot, then there's always a backlash. We're living through a backlash right now. You have all these people in the US talking about woke capitalism, right? And that, business should go back to just profit maximization, and they're passing laws to keep out BlackRock from their state and so forth. It's all ridiculous, and it's simply trying, because under the shareholder perspective, a few people, a small number of people have done very well. They've become obscenely wealthy, I would say, right? While others are suffering. That's not okay. But for those people, that system worked beautifully, and they want to hold on to that. Right? I joke that it's like Star Wars, it's the second episode. The first episode is The Force Awakens, right? This is the awakening of consciousness that we're all part of. Second episode always is The Empire Strikes Back. Because there's a status quo that is being challenged, and they want to
save it,
retain their power and privilege and money. But then the third episode is The Return of the Jedi. Right? So I think we're kind of in that middle phase right now, at least in the US, where there is a little bit of backlash going on against these ideas.
Wow, that's an amazing analogy, because I think people can relate to those. It's a hero's journey, basically, right? Coming back and amazing. So from that perspective, is it something holding us back to move faster to this ecosystem approach, to recognize that we are interdependent and not just one is better than everybody else?
Yeah, I think it's really our financial system, especially the Wall Street, and the way we look at public companies, right? And when we have a singular focus on quarterly returns, so it's very short term and it's purely financially focused, that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on companies to do the wrong things. That they will not invest for the long run, they will not invest in capital equipment and R&D, they're buying back their shares. I mean, in the last 10, 15 years, American public companies, S&P 500, have spent 93% of profits either on share buybacks or on dividends. They're not investing adequately in the future, simply to feed the appetite for constantly increasing share price, which is meaningless, because in the meantime, you're hollowing out the company. You're not going to be around in the future because you're not investing adequately. So I think this whole model that we have to reform our public markets. We have to create stock markets that actually look at the long term, right? And that they value that. And there's some movement around that. There's a long-term stock exchange that has come into being recently, right? So there's some reform that is going on, but it's not nearly enough. So meanwhile, what's happening is a lot of public companies are choosing to go private. So the number of public companies has gone down dramatically. It's about half of what it used to be. And that's a huge problem for society, because this is where we invest all our pension and all the other kind of long-term capital goes there. And now if you don't have a healthy public market, that is going to be a problem. But many companies they choose not to go public. Like Patagonia, for example, said we will not go public because that means that we will not be able to stay true to our purpose and our values. That's why they chose to do what they did, right? Which is make it a trust. And so many companies are not going public in the first place, and others who are already public, like Panera. Panera was a great conscious company. And Ron Shaich said that if after I'm gone, there's no guarantee that this will remain with the values and the purpose that we have, and the commitment to healthier food and all the rest of it will all go out when you start to become about shareholder value only, right? So he chose to take the company private. So I think that's a real challenge. And I think the biggest obstacle that we face in this movement is the way in which public markets are operating today.
So just to close this conversation on stakeholder, and already starting to connect with our next chapter, which is culture. Most companies do not recognize stakeholders as part of their corporate culture. Does it matter? Is that something to be concerned of? Or
I think it does matter because the culture touches everybody, right? So yeah, the employees are the ones who are impacted the most by it, but certainly it'll impact our culture, our customers, especially in a service business where there's direct contact between employees and customers, but even otherwise, right? And it certainly impacts our suppliers because that's the relationships that we have with our suppliers are impacted by the kind of culture that we have. So there should be a culture that actually appeals to all of the stakeholders, not just focusing on employees alone. Although again, employees are the primary emphasis when we talk about the culture.
Well, excellent. Raj, thank you very much once again. And again, to all our listeners, readers, thank you for joining forces to, work towards a more conscious and healing business ecosystem. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.